Ooh. All right, guys, let's keep this going here. We just kind of ended with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and the fact that he dies on April 3rd, 1968. That is a date that you want to make sure you try to remember, significant within the civil rights movement. And we pick up with JFK and the continuation of the Cold War. So for the last 8 years, Eisenhower has presided over a nation that, for the most part, had enjoyed peace and prosperity, but there were issues, obviously, that he did have to deal with. The increase in the rivalry with the Soviet Union as part of the Cold War, the Montgomery bus boycott with Rosa Parks, and the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and so forth. So it wasn't like it was all rose bushes. And that's kind of the country that JFK is walking into as he wins the election of 1960. The electoral vote was 303 to 219, and the popular vote was the closest it had ever been since 1888, and it was 49.7% to 49.6%. And that is the race between JFK and Richard Nixon. We'll get into more of that here in just a second. So as Kennedy takes office, he was faced with the spread of communism, obviously, and the threat of nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And he is convinced that through hard work and through persistence, that the United States can end the Cold War during his presidency. During the election of 1960, JFK's Catholicism became an important issue. Some Americans openly questioned whether a Catholic was independent enough from his church to serve as President of the United States. Kennedy dismissed such questions, insisting that a candidate's religion should not be a factor in running for office. And he says, "I'm not a Catholic candidate for president. I'm the Democratic Party's candidate for president who happens to also be Catholic." And the devotion they're talking there's a different kind of devotion to the church as a Catholic than other specific religions, and the connection with the Pope being a leader, and there were people in the United States that were nervous of that type of a connection. So JFK does win an extremely close presidential election, defeating Richard Nixon. This is the first televised election, and if we were in class, we would watch a brief video of that election. Richard Nixon did not look good at all. He was sweating profusely, constantly taking a rag and kind of wiping his face. JFK was what most would consider a very attractive individual, and so that would kind of played in the favor of JFK being the first televised election. Had people just listened to the campaign in this particular presidential debate that you see in the top right corner, if they listened to it, they said Richard Nixon won the debate because he was a little bit more versed in the politics, having just been a vice president. JFK, though, those that watched, said that he won. Both of these gentlemen had been born in the 20th century. JFK was born in 1917. Richard Nixon was born in 1913. They both served in the Navy in World War II. And they had both been actually elected into Congress in 1946. So they had very similar paths, except for they had very drastic differences as well. JFK, he was the son of a wealthy Boston businessman. His grandfather had been a state senator in the state of Massachusetts, and his father had also been an ambassador to Great Britain. JFK went on and went to Harvard, one of the most prestigious universities in the world, and he was Catholic, versus Richard Nixon. He grew up poor. He had to work his entire way through college in order to get by semester to semester, and he was a Quaker. So both different religious backgrounds, and both financial backgrounds are different as well. When Kennedy takes office, he kind of launches a different Cold War strategy, believing that we need to stress moving together with vigor and determination, and believed that under the presidency of Eisenhower, the United States kind of began to lag behind in the Cold War. So one of the first things that Kennedy does is he puts together a conventional and special military forces, believing that we shouldn't just focus on nuclear weapons like Eisenhower did. So he created what's called the Flexible Response Defense Policy, which means that the military is capable of fighting any type of war, not just nuclear war. He developed the Alliance for Progress to improve relations with Latin American countries. This is not successful by any means. It actually created an increase in tensions between the United States and Latin America, and we'll see that a little bit later here. And then he also created the Peace Corps in 1961. One of the first issues that Kennedy has to deal with is the threat of Fidel Castro, who in 1959 successfully overthrew the current Cuban government and will institute communism in a country 90 miles off the coast of the United States. Once again, people feeling as though communism just continues to win. So there are two key events between the United States and Cuba during Castro's and Kennedy's rule. After breaking ties with Cuba in 1961, the Eisenhower administration authorized the CIA to actually plan an invasion and overthrow of Castro, which breaks away from the initial response. When Castro takes control, the United States will attempt to have good relationships with Cuba and its new government. However, it becomes obvious soon after that Castro was seeking assistance from the Soviet Union, obviously a communist country and an enemy to the United States. And so it's at that point that Eisenhower authorizes the CIA to plan an invasion and overthrow of Castro. At this point, thousands of wealthy and middle-class Cubans actually flee, most of them to the areas surrounding Miami down in Florida. The first major event is the Bay of Pigs, which takes place in April of 1961. The United States will invade what is called the Bay of Pigs, which you'll see here on the map in just a second. And it was a plan put together by the CIA to overthrow Fidel Castro. The invasion involved Cuban exiles. They trained them in military policies and then how to present themselves to be U.S. soldiers who had fled Castro's rule and settled in the United States. The invasion was a complete disaster. The soldiers were poorly equipped. They landed with no protective cover. All but about 300 of the 1,400 invaders will get killed or captured. They tried to make it look as though it wasn't the United States that was actually doing this, hence the fact that they used Cuban exiles as opposed to U.S. soldiers. And the fact that it was a complete disaster and many of them ended up dead, this will strengthen Castro's rule of Cuba. Cubans became very drawn to Castro because they protected them from this invasion, and many Cuban Americans will turn against JFK and his presidency. JFK will continue his efforts to resist communists in the Western Hemisphere and continued his efforts to resist Fidel Castro, and he eventually does take responsibility for the mission's failures, and really kind of one of the dark points of JFK's presidency. And you can see here the Bay of Pigs, this little inlet of water. That's where the invasion was to take place in Cuba. These are some political cartoons. JFK smoking a Cuban cigar. You can see the word Cuba there, and Cuba blew up in his face, hence the fact that it didn't go well for him and his administration. And then you see a chicken, Bay of Pigs labeled on it with the White House, and the chicken's laying an egg on the White House, and which means that it's obviously a phrase that signifies if you're laying an egg, it means you're not best way to explain this. You're not getting the job done, essentially, is what laying an egg means. Yeah, I think that's the easiest way to explain that. So the second event is the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Cuban Missile Crisis will take place in August and September of 1962 as American intelligence agencies will photograph multiple times the Soviet nuclear arsenal that is developing on the island of Cuba. And apparently they were there to prevent the United States from another invasion brought in by Castro with the help of the Soviet Union. And what was dangerous about this was the fact that these missiles could reach multiple targets in the United States. You can see there were two locations where these launch pads were being established, and they could hit every major city within the United States and in a very short period of time, as you can see. And so that is why the United States was very fearful of these launch sites, because we were basically at this point on the verge of nuclear warfare, and that was what we were afraid of. So there were several days in there where many people prepared for the worst, which was the fact that we could potentially end up in a nuclear war with the Soviet Union from Cuba. So to resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy did two things. In the public, he in television address, Kennedy blamed Khrushchev for reckless action that threatened world peace, and he initiated a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent the Soviets from completing the sites, because they were sending supplies over by ship. Behind the scenes, Kennedy is talking to the Soviet Union and asking them to remove the missiles, and in exchange, the Soviet Union is asking that we remove missiles from Turkey and Italy. So we were, to an extent, kind of hypocrites, because we were fearful of the Soviet Union of putting missiles in Cuba, but at the same time we had launch pads and missiles sitting in Turkey and Italy that could have easily hit the Soviet Union in Moscow. So after 6 very tense days, the Soviet Union will back off. They will agree to honor the blockade and remove the missiles, and in exchange, the United States will remove their missiles from Turkey. What kind of occurs because of this, instead of kind of going through middlemen or the lengthy process of trying to communicate with one another, they set up what is called a hotline between Washington, D.C. and Moscow in order to improve communication. It wasn't like they didn't have necessarily each other on speed dial, but it established a permanent line of communication between Nikita Khrushchev and JFK, so that way something like this does not happen again. Now, in 1963, the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and 36 other countries will sign the first nuclear test ban treaty. This treaty will end above-ground nuclear testing. If you remember back to last week, we looked at some pictures of nuclear tests that were being done in the Pacific on the islands, and we started to determine in the 1960s that that type of nuclear testing is harmful to the atmosphere, go figure, and this nuclear test ban treaty will prevent any type of above-ground testing from taking place. Unfortunately, it doesn't solve most of the crisis here as part of the Cold War. Nikita Khrushchev wants the United States and JFK to pull out the military from West Berlin. Remember, that's kind of the beacon of hope to communist countries in Eastern Europe and communist Germany. And Kennedy refuses to initiate any type of withdrawal of military troops. And so because of that, Khrushchev will initiate the beginning of the Berlin Wall. Khrushchev called the situation in West Germany intolerable, the fact that the U.S. military would sit there in West Berlin, and Khrushchev even stated that he wants peace, but if Kennedy wants war, then that is his problem. And Kennedy followed up the remarks by Khrushchev by saying, it is you, not I, who wants to force change. Because the military had been in West Berlin from the get-go, and the fact that Khrushchev wanted to change that, Kennedy didn't necessarily understand. We'll pick up here with Kennedy's New Frontier in just a second.